Round 5 of the 2026 Formula 1 World Championship took place at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal, Canada, and it was always going to be a race with consequences. Heading into the weekend, Kimi Antonelli led the Drivers' Championship by 20 points over his Mercedes teammate George Russell, having taken victories in China, Japan and Miami. The intra-team battle between the two Silver Arrows drivers had already defined the early part of this season, and Montreal would only intensify it further. Russell had seized the initiative over the weekend itself, winning the sprint and taking pole position for the Grand Prix. Antonelli qualified second, behind them McLaren's Lando Norris, and Oscar Piastri filled row 2, with Lewis Hamilton fifth in the Ferrari, Max Verstappen sixth for Red Bull, Isaac Hadjar seventh, Charles Leclerc eighth, David Lindblad ninth, and Franco Colapinto 10th. Lance Stroll, racing at his home circuit, would start from the pit lane after Aston Martin changed power unit elements on his car under parc fermé conditions. Conditions at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve were cold, gusty and unsettled, with light rain falling in the build-up to lights out and a significant threat of further showers hanging over the race. That weather picture would prove central to decisions that shaped the afternoon. Before a single racing lap had been completed, the afternoon took its first unexpected turn. David Lindblad's Racing Bulls suffered a clutch failure on the grid during the formation lap, bringing proceedings to a halt. 2 additional formation laps were required before the race could begin, reducing the scheduled distance from 70 laps to 68. Lindblad would not start the race. Those extra laps also triggered an early flashpoint at McLaren, with conditions difficult and the track damp. Both Norris and Piastri had bolted on intermediate tyres, but as the formation laps unfolded, Piastri twice radioed in to say the choice was a mistake and requested a switch to slicks. The team held firm. The intermediates worked for precisely 1 lap. Piastri pitted at the end of lap 1, switching to mediums and dropping to the rear of the field. Norris led briefly, but came in at the end of lap 2, falling to 14th. The gamble had failed almost immediately, and both McLarens were now out of the fight for positions at the front. With the McLarens out of the way, Antonelli led from Russell, Hamilton, Verstappen and Leclerc. Russell applied sustained pressure and made his move on lap 6, getting ahead of Antonelli at the final chicane. Antonelli locked up, attempting to defend, ran through the runoff area and narrowly avoided contact with his teammate. The gap settled at around 1 second, with flat-spotted tyres on the Mercedes of Antonelli. What followed was one of the most compelling lead battles seen in recent Formula 1 memory. Russell and Antonelli traded the lead on multiple occasions, both drivers making mistakes, lockups at the turn 10 hairpin, moments side by side through the chicane, recoveries from the runoff, but neither able to definitely break free. Verstappen climbed into the battle, passing Hamilton on lap 9 to run third, but he was unable to stay with the Mercedes pair and eventually dropped around 5 seconds behind. Hamilton, meanwhile, reported a loss of power before recovering to continue tracking the Red Bull. Further back, Piastri's difficult afternoon worsened significantly. Attempting to pass Oliver Behrman's Haas, the Australian locked up the hairpin and ran directly into the side of Alex Albon's Williams, putting the Thai driver out of the race on the spot. Piastri pitted for a replacement front wing, and a 10-second time penalty would follow. Norris, meanwhile, continued working through the field on mediums, reaching 9th, before having to pit a second time to clear debris from his car's cooling duct. The battle at the front reached its most intense point around lap 22. Antonelli finally made a move stick at the final chicane, taking the lead down the main straight. 2 laps later, Antonelli locked up at the hairpin and Russell claimed first place, only for Antonelli to attempt another pass. The 2 cars made contact at the chicane, Antonelli cutting the corner and rejoining ahead. His engineers instructed him to surrender the position. He did so, but not before registering his frustration over the radio. The stewards confirmed there would be no further investigation into the incident. With both drivers effectively warned by the team to calm proceedings, the battle had begun to settle. only for Russell's race to end without warning on lap 30. His power unit failed suddenly at turn 8. He came to a halt on track, stepped out of the car and threw his headrest onto the circuit in frustration before striking the bodywork with his hands. A virtual safety car was deployed. It was a decisive turning point in both the race and the championship. Under the VSC, most of the front-running cars pitted and switched to medium tyres. Antonelli emerged from the stops with a lead of 4.6 seconds over Verstappen, with Hamilton now running third ahead of Hadjar and Leclerc. From that point, Antonelli was untroubled at the front. He managed the gap, responded to 2 further virtual safety car periods for debris, and crossed the line with a margin of 10.7 seconds. The most compelling narrative in the second half of the race was between Hamilton and Verstappen. The Ferrari driver steadily closed a 7-second deficit and had Verstappen in his sights by the closing laps, despite repeatedly requesting more power from his engineers. Hamilton made his move on lap 62, 6 laps from the end, going around the outside of Verstappen into turn 1. Verstappen challenged in the laps that followed, closing back to within half a second, but Hamilton held firm to cross the line second. It was his best Grand Prix result since joining Ferrari. Leclerc finished 4th after a difficult weekend, having fought his way past Hadjar following the Red Bull driver's 10-second penalty for changing direction more than once under braking. Hadjar held 5th despite serving 2 separate penalties across the afternoon. Franco Colapinto continued his run of strong form for Alpine with 6th, his best ever Formula 1 result, having survived a brush with the pit lane wall after clipping a wet patch on his exit. Liam Lawson held off a persistent Pierre Gasly to take 7th for Racing Bulls, with Gasly 8th. Carlos Sainz collected his third 9th place finish of the season for Williams, and Oliver Behrman rounded out the points in 10th for Haas. Norris retired on lap 40 with a suspected gearbox failure. Alonso retired from his Aston Martin on lap 27 with a seat problem. Perez retired from the Cadillac with a suspension failure on lap 44. Piastri finished 11th outside of the points. Russell was summoned by the stewards after the race regarding the headrest he threw onto the circuit. He received a suspending fine of €5,000 valid for 12 months after acknowledging the incident and offering a public apology. The stewards accepted it. The 30-lap battle between George Russell and Kimi Antonelli was the defining passage of this race, and it deserves detailed examination. From the moment Norris pitted and vacated the lead, the 2 Mercedes drivers were locked into a fight that oscillated constantly. Lead changes, lockups, contact and team radio instructions, all within a few tenths of a second of each other, lap after lap. What was immediately clear was that Antonelli held a marginal pace advantage. Russell's approach was tidier in execution. He made fewer errors in the early stages, but Antonelli's outright speed meant he was always a threat. The cold conditions and gusty winds at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve made tyre management critical, and the fact that being in second place actually helped warm the tyres, the car behind benefiting from the disrupted airflow, added a technical dimension to the fight beyond pure pace. The incident on lap 24, where the pair made wheel-to-wheel contact at the chicane, was the most contentious moment. Antonelli felt he had been squeezed off the track by Russell and was reluctant to give the position back. Speaking on the radio, he said, "Why, mate, he pushed me off, and I was ahead." Mercedes instructed him to comply, and he did, though the team had already begun internally signalling to both drivers to keep things clean. The stewards found no case to answer, and on reflection that verdict appears reasonable. Racing incidents of that nature, at the limit, side by side in cold conditions, are difficult to assign blame to cleanly. When Russell's power unit failed on lap 30, it ended not only his race, but a battle that had every prospect of running all the way to the checkered flag. The failure appeared to originate in the battery pack, according to the team's early assessment. Russell described his feeling in a single word: disbelief. Speaking after the race, he said, "It feels like somebody doesn't want me to fight or compete for this championship. 3 out of the last 5 races, there's just been something really going against us." Toto Wolff, speaking after the race, described the battle between his drivers as just acceptable, adding that he felt 10% less intensity would have been preferable. He confirmed the team would sit down with both drivers ahead of Monaco to discuss boundaries. What this race demonstrated above all else is the quality of both drivers. There was nothing between them. The championship fight between these two teammates has every indication of running the length of the season. McLaren's decision to start both cars on intermediate tyres will be scrutinised for some time. The reasoning is not without context. Rain had been falling in the hours before the race. The track's surface was cold and damp. In conditions where intermediates can warm quickly and offer decisive early advantage, the gamble had logic behind it. Norris's launch into turn 1, going from third to first in one corner, vindicated the approach for precisely one lap. But the track was not wet enough. The intermediates overheated almost immediately. Piastri had already flagged this during the additional formation laps, twice requesting a switch to slicks before the race had begun. The team held firm and paid the price. Both cars were in the pits by the end of lap 2. That meant Norris and Piastri were recovering from the back of the field rather than fighting at the front. A costly, self-inflicted handicap given their evident raw pace. Piastri then compounded the damage with his collision with Albon, which brought a 10-second time penalty and ended any realistic prospect of points. Norris made progress but was hampered by a second stop for a cooling duct issue, and ultimately retired with what appeared to be a gearbox failure. The net result was 0 points for both cars. McLaren now sit third in the Constructors' Championship, behind Ferrari, having lost ground at a race where their base pace may well have been competitive. Speaking after the race, Norris expected his share of responsibility, saying, "I also pushed for it myself quite a bit, so we take it on the chin." Piastri offered a concise summary of the decision. "If it rained a little bit more, we would have looked like heroes. It didn't, so we looked like idiots." That self-awareness will not recover the points, but the honest evaluation from within the team at least suggests they understand clearly where the weekend went wrong. Lewis Hamilton's second-place finish was the story within the story at the Canadian Grand Prix. It was his best Grand Prix result since joining Ferrari, and it came on a weekend where he was consistently quick from the opening session. Starting 5th, Hamilton ran 3rd in the early stages before losing the position to Verstappen on lap 9. What followed was a patient second half of the race, methodically closing a 7-second gap, managing his tyres and waiting for the right moment. The overtake on lap 62 around the outside of Verstappen into turn 1 was clean, decisive and well timed. Speaking after the race, Hamilton said, "It's the happiest day of my days at Ferrari so far." He pointed to a growing alignment with his engineering team and improved comfort with the car. That theme has emerged before in 2026, but in Montreal it was backed by a genuinely strong weekend performance. The contrast with teammate Charles Leclerc is instructive. Leclerc finished 4th but described how the weekend felt as difficult from the very first session, struggling to get his tyres into the correct working window and lacking the confidence in the car that Hamilton clearly had. Leclerc himself pointed to Hamilton's data as the reference he needs to study. That the two drivers could have had such divergent experiences in the same car on the same weekend underlines how much of Formula 1 performance at this level is about the relationship between driver and setup. For Ferrari as a constructor, the picture is encouraging. 2 cars in the points, 1 on the podium, and ground gained on McLaren in the constructors' standings. They now sit second in the team's championship, a position that reflects genuine progress. Max Verstappen's third-place finish at the Canadian Grand Prix was Red Bull's first podium of the 2026 season. That statistic alone reflects just how difficult the opening months of the campaign have been for the reigning constructor. Verstappen had qualified 6th, reporting ongoing issues with braking, rear stability and gearbox behaviour throughout the weekend. Red Bull made significant setup changes between the sprint and the main qualifying session, and by Verstappen's own admission, none of them worked as intended. In the race, however, the soft tyre suited the Red Bull well in the opening stint. Verstappen moved to 3rd by lap 9, having passed Hamilton and held that position with composure. The switch to mediums under the virtual safety car proved more challenging. Verstappen struggled to generate tyre temperature on the harder compound, which is what ultimately allowed Hamilton to close and pass him. The battle in the closing laps was an effective demonstration of both drivers' commitment. Verstappen challenged Hamilton into turn 1 in the penultimate lap, but the Ferrari held the line, half a second at the flag. Speaking after the race, Verstappen acknowledged the mixed picture. The two McLaren cars made a mess of the strategy starting on the inters, so that helps. And then, of course, George's car gave up, so that also helps to be on the podium. That condor is a fair summary of how the podium came together. Red Bull benefited from the misfortunes of others, but Verstappen was also keen to note that the team has been consistently closer to the front over the past 2 weekends than at the start of the season. Progress is being made, the gap to Mercedes remains the challenge. Outside the top 4, the midfield produced several notable performances worth examining. Franco Colapinto's 6th place was the standout. The Alpine driver has now backed up his 7th place finish in Miami with a career best result in Canada, and he did so despite clipping the pit lane wall on his pit stop exit, sustaining front wing damage that could have easily compromised his race. He managed the situation effectively and crossed the line ahead of all other midfield runners. Colapinto's trajectory over these past 2 events is one of the more encouraging stories of the season so far. Liam Lawson's 7th place for Racing Bulls also deserves credit. He started on medium tyres, a thoughtful attempt to the intermediates and softs chosen by most. He managed the race intelligently, holding off Gasly's Alpine in the closing stages after a multi-lap battle where the French driver was clearly the faster car. Lawson's defence over those final laps was composed and effective. Gasly finished 8th, having qualified 14th, making his points finish a solid recovery, though he himself acknowledged after the race that Alpine still have work to do before they are genuinely competitive, rather than picking up what is available. Carlos Sainz took 9th, his third and 9th place of the season for Williams, a result that suggests consistency rather than the outright pace the team will be targeting as the European season begins. Oliver Behrman rounded out the points in 10th for Haas. The headrest incident after Russell's retirement warrants a brief, considered mention. Russell, after bringing his car to a halt on track, threw his headrest out of the cockpit and onto the circuit surface ahead of him. It was an instinctive reaction to a moment of intense frustration, understandable in human terms, but a safety concern in a competitive environment where marshals and other drivers share the track. He appeared before the stewards after the race and accepted full responsibility. The panel issued a suspended €5,000 fine, valid for 12 months, and noted that Russell had acknowledged the incident, did not set a good example, and offered to apologise publicly. The outcome is proportionate. It was not a cynical act. It was the reaction of a driver who had just watched a dominant weekend unravel in 30 seconds through no fault of his own. The stewards recognised that context. The matter is closed. So Kimi Antonelli took the win for Mercedes, ahead of Lewis Hamilton in 2nd for Ferrari and Max Verstappen in 3rd for Red Bull. Charles Leclerc was 4th in the 2nd Ferrari, with Isaac Hadjar 5th for Red Bull. Franco Colapinto finished 6th for Alpine, Liam Lawson 7th for Racing Bulls, and Pierre Gasly 8th for the 2nd Alpine. Carlos Sainz was 9th for Williams, and Oliver Behrman rounded out the points in 10th for Haas. Arvid Lindblad did not start after his Racing Bulls suffered a clutch failure on the grid. Alex Albon retired on lap 15 following collision damage caused by contact with Oscar Piastri. Fernando Alonso retired from the Aston Martin on lap 27 with a seat problem. George Russell retired on lap 30 with a power unit failure while leading the race. Sergio Perez retired from the Cadillac on lap 34 with a suspension failure, and Lando Norris retired on lap 40 with a suspected gearbox failure. Kimi Antonelli now leads the Drivers' Championship, still on 131 points, with George Russell second on 88. Antonelli holds a 43-point advantage over his Mercedes teammate after 5 rounds. So then, Kimi Antonelli wins the 2026 Canadian Grand Prix, his 4th consecutive victory to open his Formula 1 career, and a result that extends his championship lead to 43 points over teammate George Russell. Formula 1 now heads to Europe with the Monaco Grand Prix on the weekend of the 5th to 7th of June.